Natural disasters are great events for the implementation of particular neoliberal policies, as quick action and an infusion of emergency assistance is demanded, while at the same time survivors are in shock. Such is the train of thought employed when national and transnational governmental institutions use catastrophes, whether man-made or natural disasters, to promote and empower a range of private neoliberal capitalist interests. Naomi Klein has recognized this pattern and thus coined the term disaster capitalism. Based on our research, this is precisely what occurred in Haiti in the aftermath of a 7.0 magnitude earthquake hitting Port-au-Prince on January 12, 2010. The quake killed an estimated 200,000 people and left 1.5 million people without a home. It caused massive damage to buildings and other infrastructure, leaving the city and the country in great need of emergency assistance. The global community was quick to respond, but these actions were not always in line with what local people were calling for. So, why was this the case? And what are the causes for such poor responses to the disaster? We argue that the combination of the historical context of multiple occupations and the painting of Haitians in the Western media as poor, helpless people in need of saving in an era of global neoliberal policies has placed Haiti in a position of vulnerability for disaster capitalists to profit from, while everyday citizens are left without aid or agency.
As mentioned, Haiti has a long history of colonization. By the start of the 20th century, all legislative and governmental systems were centralized in Port-au-Prince. In the lead-up to the First World War, the island became economically and politically important on the global scale, and thus, from 1915 to 1934, Haiti was occupied by the U.S. According to Haitian professor of sociology Jean Casimir, all current economic and social structures in Haiti are direct results from those years. The U.S. military dismantled village culture, broke up the peasant farming system, and dismantled services which led to little opportunity and repression in rural areas. Subsequently, massive migration to the cities occurred. The historical context of colonialism, rapid urbanization, and centralization was the scene of a massive earthquake in 2010. This, along with militarization and secularization that was validated by the Western media portrayal of the disaster, is what set the stage for disaster capitalism to take hold.
Disaster capitalism is sneaky. It is framed as direct aid to the people affected by the catastrophe. In truth, disaster capitalists see opportunity in people's misery to further the interests of private and for-profit businesses, corporations, and other elites while doing away with government intervention. The key here is a belief that the market will meet social needs when the government does not. Disaster survivors are upheld as entrepreneurs that must rebuild and create their own future, take their lives into their own hands. And this leads to the provision of aid being dependent on whether people play by the rules of the market and obey as diligent customers rather than as citizens in need.
This neoliberal narrative cannot be understood as completely selfless conceptualizations of development, as there are many foreign businesses that have made enormous profits off of cheap Haitian labor. Following the quake, stories surfaced of U.S. construction companies using the disaster to bring their operations out of the 2008 recession. At the same time, private contractors also benefited from the quake. A cable found in WikiLeaks referred to the private contracting process as quote-unquote gold rush, and questions about the contracts awarded in the aftermath of the quake arose. Disaster capitalism presented itself in Haiti through international actions. International NGOs, international businesses, and foreign governments fought for a piece of the pie in Haiti's relief program.
Aid was certainly needed after the quake hit. Haiti received an unprecedented amount of monetary support in response, the majority of which came from the U.S. Private donations reached $3.1 billion. The Red Cross raised a significant $32 million. Aid from official donors represented a staggering 400% of the Haitians' government revenue. Billions were donated, but where did all the money go? It appears that the U.S. government, the UN, international NGOs, and private contractors were the principal recipients, with a small share going directly to the government of Haiti. This money funded UN police and peacekeeping troops, who landed in Haiti in the direct aftermath of the quake, claiming to ensure public order was maintained, aid deliveries were guarded, and arrest was handled. The US military, too, received large handouts and assumed responsibility to control flights landing at the Port-au-Prince airport. This was highly criticized as their priority rested in evacuating American citizens and other foreign nationals while bringing in US military troops, who took full responsibility for all security in Haiti after the earthquake. The US military, which had signed a memorandum to ensure they remain autonomous from the UN, received the largest share of relief aid to carry out these activities. In this context, it is important to remember the long history of occupation in Haiti, including a 19-year-long US occupation. Many Haitians responded to military professionals shouting, "We don't need military aid. What we need is food and shelter."
Even NGOs raising relief money through a new tax messaging campaign were complicit in profit seeking from this disaster. As reports revealed how that money was used, questions as to the motives of those NGOs arose. Many were accused of quote-unquote non-profiteering, referring to a specific form of disaster capitalism performed by NGOs whose fundraised money was spent on, quote, projects unrelated to the disaster, luxurious lodging and transportation for humanitarian staff, and imported humanitarian supplies, unquote. As Naomi Klein convincingly describes in 2007, quote, a critical point here is that such recovery assistance funneled by the private sector replaces core functions of government and, thus, arguably reinforces neoliberal paternalistic governance, unquote. Indeed, there have been multiple charges, quote, against corporations, multinational organizations, and international NGOs for looting the Haitian people and government by means of derailed funds, empty promises, and hidden agendas, unquote.
On the other hand, locals, having no faith in the government, decided to set up their own relief programs. Squatting and informal auto construction has been the norm in Haiti since the 20th century, with 70% of Haitians currently living in informal settlements. All of these people became homeless after the earthquake, and therefore temporary camps were built in their neighborhoods. Many in need relied on remittances from relatives living abroad for financial aid. According to the World Bank, there has been an additional $380 million sent to Haitians after the earthquake, on top of the average $1.5 billion they received annually, suggesting a high dependence on family members in the diaspora due to the lack of aid from the state. Citizens who had some sort of medical training ended up trying to cure the injured, but did not have the proper medication or instruments to do so. Every day, Haitians and Haitian-led NGOs managed to self-govern their response to the disaster, yet received little to no share of the relief and reconstruction funds. The initial UN appeal completely excluded Haitian NGOs, while later versions included just 10 who requested a mere $5.4 million, equivalent to 0.4% of the total pool. In the end, only 2 Haitian organizations actually received funding, totaling less than 15% of the money requested by those 10 organizations. The lack of funding for these Haitian-led initiatives can be linked to poor and sometimes dangerous conditions in informal camps. Women are left vulnerable when, due to lack of public washrooms, go outside and get gang raped, and children run in the risk of getting trafficked to the Dominican Republic, a very common business in Haiti when night struck near camps. The physical material from which camps are made also deteriorates over time, no longer serving a purpose during the rainy season. As the numbers show, this is not due to a lack of money available, but because of how it was distributed and to whom.
While disaster recovery scholars have shown that local people need to be regarded as having agency and being able to take leadership in order to increase resilience and capacity to respond in the face of disaster, the international media did precisely the opposite, painting the image of a war scene. And while there is some truth to the narration of increased crime after a disaster, sexual assault prevalence rates did indeed increase in the internally displaced persons camps in Port-au-Prince following the earthquake, the focus on the criminalization of disaster survivors, which is often racialized, is used as justification for police brutality and the denial of provisions of basic needs and services to citizens, most of whom are innocent, ordinary people. Not only that, it also furthers the settling for neoliberal disaster governance to manifest itself.
Regarding the long-term recovery funding, A slightly higher percentage was given to the Haitian government, yet it was still low compared to what international actors received. USAID and other US agencies have been operating for several decades in Haiti, as have many large international NGOs. Yet almost nothing is known about how the money has been used in Haiti. 8 months post-earthquake, and the state began to force residents living in tents out of the area to meet the needs of businessmen, who, it turns out, did not even provide proper evidence that they owned the land in the first place. This has been a complaint voiced by millions of Haitian residents, which resulted in international institutions like the MSF admitting to failing to take into account local customs, practices, and cultures when planning for future shelter developments. 10 years have passed since the earthquake, and effects can still be observed, thanks to the weakness of institutions and the lack of organization when it comes to international aid. Disaster capitalism patterns continue as the US dumps their surplus crops into Haiti, hiding behind the excuse of international aid, while actually destroying local economies and creating a dependence on imports for food until today.
The events in the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake in Haiti were dominated by international actors, many of them private companies and NGOs, all the while that local Haitians showed leadership and agency in the face of disaster. While the situation is indeed nuanced with poor infrastructure, mistrust in the government, lack of planning and documentation, and a monopoly of land ownership by a small handful of the elite class, all of which amount to a complex situation to respond to, international actors claiming to help were perhaps actually complicating the situation further. As we have shown here, these actions have oftentimes benefited the international organizations themselves more than they have the Haitian people. Through the lens of disaster capitalism, it is clear to see that it was profits, not goodwill, that led the relief and recovery efforts, leaving Haitians as sacrificed pawns in the global neoliberal chess game.